Hello.
Hello, everybody. This is our panel tonight for Metatopia is translating non-game intellectual property into games. And we have a fabulous panel here for you for this discussion. If you guys want to go around and introduce yourselves and perhaps talk just a little bit about your relevant background for this particular topic, that would be great.
Who wants to
Daryl,
start?
do you want to start? Daryl, you
Sure.
start.
Sure, I'll start us off. My name's Daryl Andrews. I'm a freelance game designer. I do this full time. I work with a variety of different co-designers, usually making card games or board game strategy games. I've worked with a variety of fun licenses that I love and got to live my dream come true with like working on things like Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, Oregon Trail, Orphan Black, working on a Batman game, and I'm sure I'll talk about some others. Most of those either through Spin Master. I recently did the Titanic game and a Marvel game called Sinister Six. And then I started off doing some consulting for IDW, so got to do some licenses through IDW games. So that's me.
Scott, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm Scott Woodard. I have worked with a couple of IPs over the last few years. I was the brand manager and lead writer of the Savage World of Flash Gordon and The Sixth Gun, both for Pinnacle Entertainment Group. I also have a project right now that I cannot even talk about, but it's interestingly, it's based on a game publisher's IP. So that'll be interesting. I'm not sure how that really works. But and then outside of gaming, because I've worked with a lot of other licenses, I'm also known for having written Doctor Who audios for Big Finish Productions. And I've worked with a few other licenses as well, with a full background working in the film and TV industry. And that's connected to a variety of licenses as well. So I'll have lots to talk about.
Awesomeness. Robin?
I'm writer and game designer Robin D. Laws. You may know me from various projects, but the examples of other media adaptations are the role-playing games, the Dying Earth role-playing game. I did a lot of work for various Star Trek games for Last Unicorn and Decipher back in the day. And my latest project, the Yellow King role-playing game from Pelgrane Press, is inspired by the classic horror stories of Robert W. Chambers. But not only that, also by a book of my own fiction, as The Yellow Sign, based on those stories. So I had the interesting experience of recently adapting a game from my own non-game work.
There you go.
Amazing.
My name is Darren Watts. I'm a role-playing game designer and writer. Relevantly for this, I have worked on Doctor Who. I've worked on Star Trek for Modiphius. Like Scott, I am currently working on a translation from another game, basically, where we are turning the Sentinels of the Multiverse card and board game into a role-playing game, and I'm currently dealing with that right now. And then I'm also formerly was the president and owner of Hero Games and the president of Indie Press Revolution for this. Also, Metatopia is my baby as a con, so I'm delighted all of these people could show up and share it with me. So do we have something that we want to start with particularly? Is there kind of like a first principle that we want to establish for the group before we go? Is there kind of what's rule zero, basically, for taking a piece of IP and turning it into a game?
Well, I would, my own process is to ask myself, what is the backbone, the defining thing about this property? And then to boil that down into the thing that you need for any role-playing game in particular, because they are sort of open-ended in terms of what their narrative is what is the core activity of the game? So, for example, the Dying Earth role-playing game is based on the recondite Baroque fantasy of Jack Vance. And so it was a matter of breaking down what is the experience of reading Jack Vance? How do we create that in a gaming environment? And one thing you see in those stories is there's a constant comeuppance where one one sly, skeevy character seems to be ahead and messing over the other one, and then there's a reversal of fortune, and that keeps happening. And so the core mechanic for that game that I designed is one of rolls and re-rolls, where you can not only you can spend points basically to force the other player to re-roll their bad roll, their good rolls. Also, it has a lot of witty dialogue in it, and so there was a mechanic that you would bring the witty dialogue in. So the first step, I think, is to bullet point what are the major things that define this property, and then the next question is, how do I bring those into the game and translate them into mechanics?
Yeah, I mean, with something like Flash Gordon, I had 85 years of IP material to pull from, and distilling it down to what is the core, like Robin was saying, what works here for a game, and of course there's so much variance there, it's almost impossible to just zero in on one thing. But what was interesting for me was when I started to really delve into the comics, and of course when I was writing Flash, the central focus was the original comic strips.
Sure.
So out of the blue, reading those old comics, they suddenly introduced the idea of the Freemen, that there are these guerrilla fighters on Mongo. And suddenly it was like, well, we know what the players are. I mean, that's nice and easy. So as I was reading this stuff, I started to get those little bits and pieces and realize this is great. This is exactly what I need for, a player to be able to be a psionic character, for example, or someone from Earth, or whatever the case might be. And it was all there, but it was filtering and distilling everything down, just massive amounts of information to get what is the core element of the game. So.
Yeah, I think when you do that. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Daryl.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, the very first time I ever got to work on a license was actually getting to develop. And I worked under Kevin Wilson, who's a designer I love. And he gave me the really great advice of trying to focus on kind of like the turning points. Like, what would the highlight moment be? And also, like, really encourage this idea of, like, look for signposts along the way. You're trying to capture this experience of walking through this world, but you can't capture everything, and you don't want to create a simulation. You really just want to really touch on these like kind of emotional moments. And so for me, like, that was really great advice early on, to just like feel free enough to like dabble with in that world, in that sandbox, but really try to capture everything, but instead just like what's the kind of the emotional heart of the experience. And so for me, I was a huge Turtles fan, and he was working on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I got to develop Shadows of the Past, where he made this awesome fighting game, and I just got to work on scenarios, and it was really fun to just be like, oh, well, Michelangelo should grind this thing because he'd be on a skateboard, or, like just talking through things like that. And those were like the moments that you made up as a kid in your head anyway, so how can we recapture those moments now? So for me,
I was going to say, much of the appeal of it is the idea of, just for this moment, at least I'm the writer, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, there's just a lot of fun that you can have. And I think just exploring that fun, like early on, I just immersed myself in like remembering what were my favorite moments, what were like kind of the core emotional response that I had, and then try to create something for others to be able to join in.
Right. Yeah, and like with Flash Gordon, I was a Flash Gordon fan as a kid, so I always thought about that in the back of my head when I was writing. Like, what made me love this stuff as a little kid, and why do I still love it? So that was extraordinarily helpful to focus on that as well.
Right. What part of this made me a fan in the first place?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also a matter of accessing whatever resources are being provided to you and knowing the material. And sometimes you get lucky and have direct access. So, for example, I got an opportunity to speak on the phone to Jack Vance and quiz him about his world, and had a chance to chat with him. And so one of the other things that I think everybody runs into when they're really dealing with licensed games is your relationship with the license holder, and that can be very different for every experience, and sometimes it can be very challenging. The bigger and more expensive the property, and the more people who are responsible for approving things, the more challenging it can be. And some licensed property owners are famous sticklers who will shoot down certain ideas. Others are more laissez-faire, and your success or failure on this is going to be determined by not only what the audience thinks of it, but what the license holder thinks of it. And one of the challenges often with role-playing games in various licenses is that there's a lot of material for the license holders to go through for what is a famously non-lucrative slice of the media market.
Dominic at Cubicle 7 always used to joke that when he knew that when he sent material into the BBC for approval for Doctor Who, that he was putting his product in a pile on somebody's desk underneath the Doctor Who coffee mug and everything else that was like going out that week, and knowing the amount of time he was going to be asking that approval person, in that time they could have approved 100 different coffee mugs, right? And so like making sure that you could like get your product into that pile somewhere at least in order to get it approved was a big chunk of learning how to manage that licensor relationship, right? Of like making sure that somebody was going to look at it, because it's not worth their time on a completely objective basis, right? So
yeah, I was so lucky with the Six Gun, for example, because when I got that, not only was the game publisher Pinnacle excited about the project, but the publisher of the comic was excited as well. So immediately they came at me and just said, "What do you need? We'll give you whatever you want." I literally had boxes of graphic novels showing up at my door from Oni, and I had an open door policy with them, so I could reach out to Cullen Bunn, the writer, or Brian Hurt, the artist, anytime I wanted, and ask him, "Does this work? Does this not work?"
Right.
And the great thing was, it was absolutely the dream. The better part of the dream was that I would send stuff to them, and they would say, "This is perfect." I was like, "I would change this?" No, they're like, "You totally get this world."
There you go.
The Six Guns, and so I was. It was so easy to write with those guys.
Absolutely.
That's like the opposite of my beginning experience, especially with IDW. We would often like write these like pitch documents just trying to get the license rights, and we would get into these like little debates over every little splicing of like, oh well, we can make a game, but we can't have dice and we can't have a board,
right? Because those rights belong to somebody else.
Because those are someone else's. But we're open to something if you can make up something in the middle. Like you can make a board out of tile, so it's not a board.
Right.
And then we would ask back, like, well, what about like the makers? Like, what like interaction with them? Like, no, you don't talk to them.
Hero got the PS238 license literally because the creator of PS238 happened to be walking down the right aisle at Gen Con at the right time. And a friend of his said, "Hadn't you always said you wanted to have a game made out of this?" And he's like, "Yeah, I have." And, we started a conversation there, spoke for about half an hour. Conversation was like, what would it take to make this happen? And we gave him what we thought were a completely unreasonable list of requirements on our part to make this happen. And he just kind of like looked at us for a second, going like, "Yeah, that sounds good." And we just made a book, right? Like we just turned that just happened right in front of us, right? We were all just like, gobstopped that like it had happened that easily, right? So
right place, right time, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. So
cool.
So how much of this, in that case, comes from the nature of the game? You were talking about like the different, like what the requirements that you had to like live through. Like, okay, I can use dice or I can't use dice or whatever. How much does that actually wind up in the end influencing your design decisions? The restrictions that like wind up getting placed on what you're doing, and the restrictions that come with working in any particular subfield of game, right? Like a dice game has to have this in it or whatever.
Sure. I mean, for me, and I'm sure it's true of the others, like restraint is a beautiful thing for designers, because we need to, have limits, or else we might go down too many paths and too many ways and too
Sure.
many side bunny trails. But the other thing that was neat for my opportunity at IDW was I not only got to design some, but I also scouted for games for them where they would already have the license in mind, and they were looking to find already created designs that they could fit quickly and adapt to the license. And so it became a real fun thing. Those restraints became like what I looked for. Like I would be like, oh, like, has anyone seen any cool like dice games here? And that, for me, like in the back of my mind, I know like, oh, I'm looking for like a Dragon Ball Z dice game. And so like then I'd go out and see, like, I'd look through the lens of, I have these restraints and I need something that maybe captures like a fun experience, and then find those marriages. And my favorite one, I mentioned Dragon Ball Z, but I ended up finding someone who worked for Funimation formerly, and their dream scenario was to make a Dragon Ball Z game, and I knew that in the back of my mind, and they had a game that fit, and I got to like marry those together. Or like another one was Emerson Matsusuchi. Like one time I was talking to him, and he's done some great games like Century and Reef and you name it. And I asked him, like, would you ever make a licensed game? And he said, well, my dream license is Metal Gear Solid. And then again, that was another license that we had in the background.
It's
now
the thing that you could actually, I can provide that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's just like a really fun thing to even bring, the restraints and the designer and the licensor together and find kind of that marriage. I think that's a really fun moment to even just be a part of. So,
sure.
Yeah, I mean,
when we had,
again, oh, go ahead.
No, please, Scott, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in regards to Flash, like I said, it's an 85, 86-year-old IP now, and there's just so much material. But at the same time, when I first signed the contract, I was told stay away from the movie, because it's just tied up with multiple studios, and so we don't really want to do anything with a film. Even though, if we had to do something, we had to tie certain elements into the game. I mean, there was no question. I mean, you see, if you look at the book, I mean, it's got the logo from the film.
Yeah.
But also, I started to realize, well, what about the comics that have been published over the years? Because there's been so many. And I was told, well, stay clear of all the current stuff, or the more recent stuff. I think Dynamite was producing Flash. They may still have Flash now. So we can't do anything with that. Okay, fine. Well, what about that? And then it started to sort of get down to the point where I just thought, well, let's just focus on, I guess, the original comic strips, because those are, we've got full access to those.
What we're sure of.
We're absolutely sure of. We also knew that, mainly because of a public domain issue, that I could wade into the serials, both the film and the radio serials, without a problem, because that was still King Features. But then you start to get like the 1950s German-U.S. co-production TV series, and you get the 1980s novels, and you get all this weird stuff that kind of pops up. And what I wound up doing was I still was focusing entirely on that older stuff. But how could I make sure that every Flash Gordon fan of every stripe is happy with what I put into this book? And so it's loaded with Easter eggs. I skirt some of the things I was told not necessarily to include, but I did it in a tactful way. But then what wound up happening towards the end is suddenly I was getting word down that, oh no, we can actually start incorporating a few more things that we told you not to use from the outset. So it actually worked out quite nicely, because at that point I had pretty much had a full manuscript, and then I could just sort of scribble back and drop a few things here and there.
Go put more of that back in, make it explicit, right?
Yeah.
With Cubicle 7, we had a run where we were doing a book each on each individual doctor, right? Like going back to the first one, right? And so we did a source book on like 1 through 8 basically, and I was one of the people working on. I did the 5th, and then I didn't work on another one again until the 8th. And I was just like, how do we have anything? There's one movie for the for the 8th Doctor, right? There's no other material. And so like my immediate response was, oh, we'll use all of the Big Finish stuff, right? There's a million things in that. And they're like, oh, sorry, we do not have the rights to Big Finish. So our reference book to the Eighth Doctor does not explicitly say anything about the Big Finish stuff, but it's clear reading all the way through it that we've all heard that stuff, right? There's a bunch of kind of like sideways references to that material. And then the way we actually solved it was, since it was the end of a line of like the revival Doctor Who's, the second half of the Eighth Doctor book was just a mega campaign in which you met Doctors 1 through 8, right? It was just kind of like the end of the line, basically. Wrap up was to say, okay, we're just going to fill the rest of this book because otherwise it would only be 60 pages long.
Yeah, it frustrates me that you guys were never able to put the audios in there because, of course,
we tried over and over again.
To put it in the game somehow.
Dominic tried over and over again, but no. Robin, you were about to say something?
We've been talking a lot about the complexities of an arrangement where you're dealing with a license holder. Often that means that as a designer, you have to be approached by the company that has acquired the license, or sometimes the licensor will seek out a game publisher. So at this point, I would like to recommend to beginning designers who are watching this to consider doing what I did with the Yellow King, which is base it on something in the public domain where you can do whatever you want. If everybody owns the rights, the downside to that is that everybody owns the rights, so that if you do a Three Musketeers game, so can somebody else.
Right.
But the advantages there are obvious, right? That you aren't paying a licensing fee. You're focusing presumably either on something that you are incredibly passionate about and want to do, or something that enough other people know that it already has that name recognition. Because I guess this brings us also into the broader discussion of why do a licensed game. What are the advantages
Sure.
and disadvantages of that? And spoiler alert, the advantage of doing a licensed game is that people are already aware of the thing that you're making a game about. It already has brand recognition. And the drawback, though, as a designer that you want to think about, especially if you're working professionally, is that a licensed game will probably go away. If it is something held by a license holder, that the licenses are often quite short. Star Wars and Star Trek, for example, have bounced from one company to the next over the years. And once that license expires, your game will be unavailable except on eBay.
Right.
And so if you are investing your heart and soul and time and work and reputation into something, you should be aware of the fact that you're not going to have an evergreen title that people are going to be able to associate with you. So it's a nice thing to do every so often if you especially love something. But as a piece of career advice, I would say to publishers, there are some publishers that, that's just what they do, and they churn through all of these different licenses, and that's their business model. But if you're doing mostly your own stuff and you're thinking of getting a license, that's a big question to ask yourself: is do I want to pay the extra number of cents per copy to somebody else? Do I want to reduce my margins? And as a designer, do I want to do something that's going to have a really short shelf life, or do I want to try to create something of my own that will exist as long as people are interested in finding it?
Right.
I jump on that as well, and just again, a tip, especially for new designers, it's to put that into some practical terms for yourself as a designer. Is your royalty is going to be different if you're working on a license than not, and that might seem obvious, but the reality is it's quite a small royalty, at least in board game hobby space, if you're going to work on a license, because the publisher needs enough room to pay for. If you're not self-publishing, the publisher needs that room able to cover those points. So as a designer, you're going to make a lot less, and as Robin mentioned, probably just one print run, and it might be a bigger print run, which is
I was going to say, right. Keeping in mind that you'll sell more from out the door, but yes,
right. You'll sell more, and there'll be one great, one great check, but also remember, you're putting in all that time, and then it's an idea that you've licensed out, and now it's gone, and you're probably not going to really be able to use much of what you learned from that experience and put into that experience. But it's great that you got to work in that world. So I just throw that out there also as a kind of a caution and tip that the reality of your contract is going to be a lot different compared to if you make a game and it becomes an evergreen and you get to expand and add to that game or build in that universe or you name it. There are some trade-offs there.
Absolutely. And that the trade-offs, I mean, when you're calculating that final decision at the end, keep in mind how much you've already got your thumb on the scale of, oh my God, I just really wanted to work on this, right? Because this is this is me, fulfilling my dream that I've had since being 8 years old, right? Kind of thing. It's like, I only worked on one Star Trek book. And I did it literally because I just very much wanted to have a Star Trek book on my resume, right? I wanted to say that I'd done it. I wanted to be able to kind of like high five my inner 8-year-old and say, look what you did, kind of thing. But no, that's not a way to, that wasn't a way to make a living doing it, right? I was delighted with doing it. I had all kinds of fun. Couldn't be happier. I don't think I'm going to do it again. It's not like they come up again. But I for the rest of my life, I'll be able to say, oh yeah, I did a Star Trek book, right? That's awesome. So
yeah, I was really
lucky. When you're calculating that, you can kind of like say, well, keep in mind, yes, I got paid reasonably well because they paid well for it, and I also got to fulfill this dream. But on the other hand, like I said, or as you said, I'm never going to see another dime from that work, right? That's not
Yeah, I got really lucky with Flash because it was like a year and a half ago or something we released it, and literally 2 months ago, I was asked if I wanted to write another supplement. So it was, I thought, well, we're kind of done, one and done. But lo and behold, there was another supplement. And
excellent. Well, if everybody's happy, then
that's done and it's off. Yeah, so hopefully that'll be out soon.
The other thing I'd mention, piggybacking off of what Robin said, is if you design something that's still like inspired by, influenced by something that you love that could be licensed, it doesn't mean that it couldn't get adapted. So, for instance, like I designed a game with my co-designer Adrian Adamescu, and we really wanted to make a heist game, and so we designed this game and we pitched it to a publisher that we thought would really do a great job with it, and it kind of broke our hearts when they said no, and we shelved it because we just needed to distance ourselves from it. And then fast forward a year and a half later, I'm talking to a publisher, and the publisher just kind of opens up about how frustrated they are that they have this license and they need to have a game done by this certain time, and that the person that they had on it made an awesome game, but then it just kept evolving away from the initial design goals, and it became like another cool game, but it doesn't fit anymore for the license.
Right.
And the thing they described was like word for word this game. It was like he kept talking, and I was like holding my breath, like, don't speak too quick. Don't speak too quick.
Just breathing next to him, yeah.
Right? And then when he was done, I was like, well, if you need, I could literally, on my phone, send you a PNP, a rule file, a video of everything. And he was like, yeah, send it. Who knows? And then the next day, it was at Essen. The next day, he flagged me down, and he went, so we printed it out and played it. And we're in, and so that became Sinister Six,
right? Because
it was all about these bad guys pulling off these heists together, and Spidey kept getting in the way. So, not that it ever has worked out that awesome in my life for anything else, but it does show like you can just work on a game, and then if opportunity strikes, you can adapt, you can tweak, you can change it.
Sure.
Oh, go ahead.
That also shows that you, as a designer, need to be able to think on your feet in a pitch meeting, because often you will be sort of hit on the spur of the moment with, well, what would you do with X? And you don't know what X is going in. And so that design process is something you have to be able to train to wake up at a moment's notice and sort of zero in on what you think the license holder thinks the core thing about their property is, and what will excite them,
and
right? Sell exactly. them on, and so not only come up with an idea that sounds like a fresh, interesting angle, and ideally is, until you sound like it, but also one that excites their interest in what they're doing. And so, I guess that goes back to the level of there's just a whole extra layer of diplomacy and designing on the spot and self-presentation that you may find yourself engaged in if you're meeting with license holders who care enough about what it is that you're going to do to actually ask for the details. And in other cases, it'll just be, we need a Click Minis game. Do that, and then that, and then your process of coming up with the question, well, how do I interface Click Minis, this existing format that people have assumptions about, with the assumptions that they have about the setting, and how do I make those go together? And there you have the luxury of going off and being able to think about it, whereas sometimes you just get a ball thrown at you and have to respond
and just react quickly, right?
Yeah.
Have any of you ever had a situation where somebody kind of like presented you with an IP specifically? I mean, like you were saying, it kind of like matched a thing that you had already been doing, Daryl, but where like you found a use for a piece of design that you'd always kind of like carried in your head but had not found the right place to use it, and then you were suddenly like, oh, why didn't I think of that? I should have done it with a Yellow King, or whatever.
Well, I have a funny story about that one with indie boards and cards. I had a co-design with Erica Boyoris, and we had designed a game. We thought it was a cute idea of decorating crabs, how crabs like add things to their shell, and they have this. And so we had this mechanic going that was 3D, and it was almost dexterity-ish, but it didn't really make sense. Like, we'd pitch it around, and then all of a sudden we had a meeting with Indie Boards and Cards, and it just hit us. We had just seen they had Kadama, which is a game about a growing tree where you're adding branches. And in the meeting, we were like, well, imagine this crab game was actually a tree, and like we just talked about it in Kodama language the whole time during the pitch. And on the spot, they were like, oh, yeah, okay. And it was funny because, like, we went into the meeting not thinking it at all, but when at the beginning of the meeting, we would ask questions like, so what kind of things are you looking for?
Struck by inspiration, basically.
Yeah. And then they mentioned, like, well, we're looking to expand the Kodama line. And we're like, oh, okay. And then just, like, talked about it in those terms. And then, like, we left the meeting, and both Erica and I kind of looked at each other, and we're like, why didn't we think of that before? Like, it's such an obvious fit, and now, like, the game came out, and it's like, yeah, I can't imagine it not being a tree. And they came up with a story to, like, how the branches work, but...
What kind of idiot thought this should be about crabs? Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's always been about trees. I don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly.
I know, for example, that the original designers of the Doctor Who mechanic had several of their concepts for the RPG had been kind of like sitting around, and they were probably to a certain extent inspired by the fact that everybody, who was working on the game had been a Doctor Who fan, but the people who had done it they didn't have the license at the time that they had started writing it, right? There's individual mechanics in the RPG that just turned out to be ideal for Doctor Who once the concept came up, right? Because the Doctor Who RPG is a very light, quick action RPG that doesn't have a whole lot that kind of like really separates it from other similar RPGs of its type. But for example, the initiative mechanic in Doctor Who specifically says anybody who wants to run away goes first. Anybody who wants to talk about a problem goes second. Anybody who wants to, do something else, like an action that is not violent goes third. And anybody who wants to be violent goes last. Right? And they suddenly realize it's like, that's, that's a level of understanding of kind of like the Doctor Who ethos that's surprisingly deep, right? And it makes your game actually feel like, oh, I'm working in that, in that space. That's how my adventure is going to unroll, right?
Right.
And it turned out to be this incredibly valuable piece of mechanics to the game, to making it feel, like it's a Doctor Who game. So.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, I think that's pretty common, certainly with RPG stuff. If you're working from an IP, you're going to find something in there and say, how can I make that work? in the
Right.
context of the game. So that's a perfect example. And I know that there's things that I've written. I'm working, for the most part, I write for Savage World, so I have to sort of work within an existing system. But I still have to figure out, well, how did that thing happen in that comic, or how did that thing happen in Flash Gordon, and can we make it work within the confines of the system? And then I throw it in there, and then it gets either kept or kicked out. So you never know.
It's codified or it's not. Yeah.
Right.
Robin?
And the Doctor Who example is a great one of for any game, especially a game within a category that already has a lot of other games in it. You need to create a point of distinction that makes it different from other games and memorable as such. And you could tell yourself, especially if you're working with a company that just has the same core system that they apply to every IP, that, oh, well, the fact that this is the this is the Mandalorian game, and that having Baby Yoda in it is what people care about. So I don't have to worry about the design part of that. But if you can do what is done with Doctor Who and have something that is memorable mechanic that is also emblematic of the property, that's that sort of cross-point design that I think makes a really great licensed game. So that's something. You're phenomenally lucky if your not quite gelling hermit crab game happens to be better as a tree game, and you realize that in mid-meeting. But most of the time, you're going to be looking at what the property is and trying to find its essence. And just in general, I am often asked, do you ever come up with a mechanic and then try to find a game to fit it into? And not only do I never do that, I would strongly recommend it against doing that, because that's, you're sort of back rationalizing from something that is not interesting, which is a game mechanic, to what is the emotional implication of this game mechanic, and then what is the framework and the story that I can put on that. Well, if you are a game designer, maybe game mechanics are interesting, and if you're one particular.
I love it.
But the chances that you're going to produce a game that is interesting only to you increase radically if you start with the mechanic.
If you're starting from a mechanic,
emotional experience that the mechanic is supposed to convey. And if you're, even very simple games have in fact, the most successful, biggest simple games have very strong emotional hooks to them, right? The game of Sorry, or even the hideous slog that is Monopoly, which was not designed to be a good game. It was designed to teach you that Monopoly capitalism sucks.
Right.
And so
diplomacy.
Yes.
Right.
And so you want to start with what is the feeling that you're going to convey, and then move through that to the mechanic, because I've seen a lot of people's games that they want to bring to market that are, well, you've worked on this mechanic for 12 years, and I can tell that, and I can tell you really love it, but it's not a clear idea. And a clear idea is always a clear emotional idea. And the fact that you have a property to work with in this instance is already an enormous leg up, because you've already got something in another medium that conveys a particular feeling. And so that's what you need to hook into.
We've talked about the emotional sense, as you were saying, that comes with the property, right, for us. And we've talked about having to satisfy the master, both the master of, let's make a good game that people are going to want to keep playing, and also satisfy the licensor that we have, followed everything that they've asked us to do for this. But there is a third master in this equation, of course, which is the people who were the fans of this piece of intellectual property before you even started with the game. And on some level, you're going to have to interact with them and satisfy them. Have you had particularly notable circumstances when you're interacting with fans of an IP that you designed a game for that were either positive or negative, that were just, interesting in, hearing their reactions to your game when they saw it?
I'll say the one thing that's been fascinating in regards to Flash is because it has appeared in so many different types of media, that there are very unique Flash Gordon fans. There's the fan of the serials, the fan of the 1980 movie, the fan of the comics, whatever. And I have been very lucky because I belong to a whole bunch of Flash Gordon Facebook groups, and of course I waded in stealthily and did not really necessarily reveal what I had done, just to kind of test the water, so to speak. But when I started to reveal what I had created, and a lot of people had chimed in and said that they had the game, all these different people with all these different interests in Flash Gordon loved it. And it was interesting because, I suddenly was getting the even just the fan who was, well, I just love everything about the universe. I don't play games, but everything you've done is great source material. I love it. It's wonderful. And then the 1980 movie fan is just like, oh, I love that you have the little references, hidden away in there. So I've been extremely lucky with something like that, which, despite its long, infinite pedigree, and all the different types of fans, everybody seems to universally adore it. I have not really run up against anybody who's been dissatisfied with it in the slightest. So I've been extremely lucky. Now I know that's not always the case.
That is so not my experience. That's wonderful.
I wish
Doctor Who fan was different.
A little bit. Star Trek also, yeah.
I've definitely had a mixed bag of reactions, but the most recent one that's been kind of interesting was working on Titanic. It was such a kind of like an unexpected license with a game, and even though it's popular, we had no idea if people would want it as a board game. And it was fascinating to see the initial response, and even still, like the first thing people do is they throw out jokes like, "Oh, it's going to be, a big hit. It's gonna, it's a real sinker. I hope they included like the vehicle scene or whatever. Like people will make all these little like comments, but the fun part, especially before it came out, was seeing all these jokes, and thankfully the publisher let us put all those jokes in the game. We tried to just go like, hey, people are going to make fun of this, so let's just like include them in the joke. And
let's lean into that and make it,
And so like the irony is some of the criticism is also in my mind kind of a bit of a compliment because people get it, that it is kind of unusual of a theme, and yet all those funny moments are hopefully the funny moments when you crack it open and you play.
When you play, right, yeah.
Yeah, and so like as we started to see some reviews come out, it was fun to see like the same comments that were coming out before, then the reviewers got it and said, hey, it's in there. And like, so like for me, I think even though it was, kind of a mixed reaction, I still think it was true to the feeling that we were trying to go for. And so that's really fun to see like people kind of get into it.
Sure.
And then we got to see that even in the playtesting part as well. Like if you're not capturing that through your development and design time, like it's not going to just show up. So the beauty was we were already seeing that kind of reaction of playtesters making jokes and belittling it and then playing it and then having a great time and being like, hey, can I play that again? So like that's what, you're going to hopefully see examples throughout kind of your design and development that will then echo hopefully in the long term.
And if you're choosing to interact with the general community for a fan property, you should be aware of what your goals are in that too, right? It may just be strictly marketing. You just want them to know about the game. B, you might want to try and get a sense of what fans of this property like. But there's where we go to mention a property. You go, danger, danger, Will Robinson, because the people who are most passionately engaged with an existing property may not actually be representative of the broad audience of people who are open to playing that game. In a case of a role-playing game, probably there'll be maybe one super fan of, say, Star Trek in the group, and everybody else kind of likes Star Trek. And so you got to make sure that your game appeals to the person who's casually interested in the property as well. As we've sort of skipped over the idea that some fandoms are deeply toxic, and you want to know, and you might want to know how much you want to engage with a fandom that has that a problem. Or I think you were sort of hinting at the fact that many Doctor Who fans watch Doctor Who to compare to why this isn't their Doctor, because their Doctor was 3 or 4 or 5, and that's the full extent of their enjoyment of the property now is not liking Doctor Who. And you also want to be careful about, there are people who often will have an agenda for a property where it's like, I really want, more emphasis on the fishmen. I've been super interested in the fishmen all these years. You got to go, well, okay, the fishman demographic is that particular person. And you will also, if you're not careful, get sort of pulled away from the ethos of the show by the people who love it most. For example, when you do a Star Trek game, there are a bunch of fans who go, finally, a role-playing game will have to lay out exactly how far Earth is from Kronos, the Klingon homeworld. And of course, actual Trek watchers know that it's a different distance each episode depending on the plot requirements. And if you actually give the simulationist approach of, no, this is a world with rules, and the planets are fixed distances from each other, and that you're actually failing to understand what Star Trek does and why Star Trek does it. And so, for example, the idea that talking is faster than shooting in Doctor Who is brilliant.
Exactly.
And it's not about based on someone's perception of it. Well, let's finally make Doctor Who make sense, because Doctor Who really existed. They were just shooting. Well, of course, you can't
constantly, right? Exactly, right. We did the one time, my most recent kind of interaction with a fan base for this was that I did the licensed card game for We Rate Dogs for the Twitter account. And that specifically came about where, in a situation where we were working on another game, and we were literally working on a dog show game. And the whole time that we were working on it, as fans of the We Rate Dogs account, we kept making We Rate Dogs jokes. And about the fifth one of those that went flying by, one of the people in the group said, has anybody ever called that guy? Is that like a thing? Is that licensable or whatever? And we called him, and it turned out it was licensable, and we completely rewrote the game to match that. But as we were doing it, we suddenly realized, that there's this a fan base that none of us in our game experience had ever encountered for, because it existed entirely within Twitter, right? And there was no other place to go to kind of like contact and interact with people for it. And so we were suddenly found ourselves in what, to us as designers and largely people well over the age of 40, at least for this, were kind of unfamiliar with like how Twitter worked and how Twitter interacted, and it took us a while to kind of catch up with that. Fortunately, in our case, we had brought this when we realized what we had, what was on us. We realized it had largely outgrown our ability to manage it on our own. So we brought in a publisher. We brought it to a publisher, and the publisher in that case was Chronicle Books. And Chronicle Books, being the publisher of Grumpy Cat and things like that, they understood how to do memes, right? Like they understood how to interact with an audience like that on a level that we were completely unable to do. And we were delighted to turn that over to the professionals who knew how to handle, like meme stuff, right?
For that one, how did the fact that you were aiming at a largely non-gamer mass audience change your game design process?
I don't know that we knew all along it was going to be a pretty simple game. So I'm not sure we had to kind of like change any of kind of like the fundamentals of the game. It was really much more a change of the presentation for it, of like not assuming that these people had any kind of like background or understanding of other card games, right? So what we were going to need to explain and kind of like walk them through, was we just needed to kind of like be aware that the idea of like moving a deck of cards around on a table for this was going to be a new concept for them. We had no kind of like assumed understanding of how card games work, right? So, from that point of view, we kind of like changed it, but I think it only encouraged us more to make sure that it turned out to be a very simple game,
And did you reach out to testers who were unblemished by knowledge of many other games?
To the best of our ability, yes. I mean, it started as a Metatopia thing, right? So like the original audience for it, the original test audience for it was, but then we took it to bookstores for tests after that for the places where it actually sold, because it sold much better in bookstores than it ever did in a game shop, right? So like we knew that that's kind of where our audience was, and so we actually did that. We tested them in actual bookstores with just customers in the bookstore. So
Because our core hobby audience would go, well, these dogs are great, but do they have lasers?
right, yeah, exactly. Well, and we had a lot of them, for where people were, kind of like startled. They would pick up the game and knew that we were selling this on the adorable pictures of cards on the of dogs on the cards, right? And the best compliments we ever got from serious gamers were, "This game is much better than it needs to be." Right? This is going to sell just fine from the pictures, right? The fact that you guys have actually made a mechanically sound game is kind of a delightful surprise to us. We weren't really expecting it. So,
because the bigger the license, the more likely it is that someone will buy it for somebody else, and they'll look at it and probably play it. That if you get a game that people replay a lot, there's possibly it may wind up that people take that and keep playing it, and you can iterate it into other things, but you may never really know, except as a labor of love that you perform for yourself, how elegant that design was, or in fact, if anyone played it a third time.
Right, exactly. All right, we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to hit the one question that we've kind of like missed for all of this, which is, given that all of us have these experiences with them, what is the dream license? What is the license you have never worked on that you would really want to, whether or not it is, and if you have two different answers for this, that's okay, whether or not it's a commercially viable license or not, right? Like what's the main thing that you would want to do of something that you think would sell, and what is the thing that you would do if money were no object whatsoever? And once again, starting to my left here, why don't I have Daryl do that first? So
sure. Yeah, my answer is actually pretty fast and pretty easy. I would Star Wars is my no-brainer. That would be a dream come true. I'd also caveat and say Transformers as well, as a viable option if I ever had the chance. But what I still wrestle with and wish is viable, and maybe someday it will be, is I'm a big sports fan, and I would love to make a strategy board game that's also sports themed, like licensed like NBA or baseball or something like that. So that seems less viable, and I've thrown my hat a few times at that, and I'm going to keep trying, but I'm not sure if that is a real viable license. It doesn't seem to have. There's no sports hobby themed games that are a hit yet, so maybe
Hoop Gods is doing pretty well on Kickstarter right now. So.
True. And I'm happy to see that.
And Omari is here. Omari's a guest at the show, so you can talk to him about that.
To Omari, so if people keep buying that game, if that's the first example, I don't mind opening the floodgates, and then they're
sure, absolutely, awesome. All right, Scott.
I would love to do a Planet of the Apes official RPG. I think it would be a lot of fun. I mean, there's certainly plenty of material to pull from there too. That would be sort of the moneymaker. But for like stuff that I just would like to do, because either John Christopher's The Tripods series, the trilogy, which a lot of us read in Boy's Life magazine,
sure,
or the world of Jerry Anderson. Like, I would love to delve into the Jerry Anderson universe as well. I mean, whether it's something to do with Space 1999 or UFO or something, I think it would be a blast to do that kind of an RPG.
Well, I think I've pretty much proven that there wasn't much interest in it so far. Anyway, so. Okay, Robin.
I used to say yes, Minister, but a more updated version of that is, of course, the or V. And so, maybe someday Armando Iannucci will do something based on whatever his new thing is. A Death of Stalin one shot would be delightful.
Is there a big money one that you haven't worked on that you would want to? Or was Yesminster your answer?
That's not a big money one.
No, I know, I'm kidding.
I can't really, because as I sort of alluded to, that the bigger the property is, the less room you have to play. I've been, able to mess with, some of my dream properties over the years. Like Dying Earth was a perfect fit, and
Sure.
and some of the bigger ones, and also just the ones that are really huge. There's just a ton of material to catch up on, right? That you have to factor in. Was alluded to earlier that you might get paid less. I would argue you should negotiate to get paid more because it has a shorter shelf life and is going to do less to promote you, right? The brand is the thing that people will remember, not that you did the design for it.
Right.
That I'm in the years that I have left on this earth, I would prefer to do things that express my own worldview rather than demonstrate the extent to which I can match somebody else's worldview, given that I've already done some of my favorite things.
Right, yeah.
On my list, right?
Sure. I think mine would have to be my big money one I've never got a chance to work on would be Marvel. Would be a Marvel Comics game. I have not gotten a chance to work on one of those yet. I certainly hope the next time it comes through, because God knows there will be another one coming soon. That I'll
Would it be 6 or 7?
Yeah, to get whatever number we're on, I hope it matches up with the free point in my schedule. And for the thing that I would love to work on is
what it
money
is.
we're not thinking. Exactly right. I'm going to go with the group theme here of like British TV and say it's Blake 7. So,
Absolutely.
that's the game that I want. And Scott and I have already talked about making this game. So
I'd love to.
someday we'll get that done. But
10 Star Games had he was questioning my reference to John Christopher, the author of the Tripod series. I assure you, it is John Christopher, but I am a huge John Wyndham fan too. So that's just want to mention that.
all right, excellent. Well, thank you all very much. Thanks for coming out for this, and thank you to the audience who stuck around for all of this. I hope it was interesting to you. Please stick around, in the chat rooms here for this. We'll be back to answer additional questions if you might have them. And thank you to my fellow panelists here. I appreciate you coming out.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much. It was great.
Thank you.